This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. We're talking about chronic wasting disease this week and domestic game farms. Recently, Idaho Game and Fish had to kill 82 mule deer that breached an elk game farm fence, and it made us think about where else this could be an issue. But before that, we have some updates from the week. A recent study was published in the Journal of Current Biology that found that the further mule deer walk, the fatter they are. The data analyzed by Anna Ortega and others comes from a massive collaborative effort in Wyoming involving hundreds of deer covering hundreds of miles for almost a decade. They've been tracking and collecting biological samples from mule deer to identify important migration routes, summer range, winter range, nutritional factors, fawn survival, and they've been learning an incredible amount. You might notice some familiar co-author names, Matt Kaufman and Kevin Monteith, both of which have been guests of Randy on the Hunt Talk podcast. So in this recent study, they were able to find that deer that covered vast distances were able to put on more fat than deer that remained resident to one spot. Having more fat has been shown to produce healthier fawns that are more likely to survive. Simply put, the deer that participate in the super long migration are more productive to the total population. It wasn't just that these deer were walking a long ways, it was the fact that they were able to follow the green wave. By moving and seeking out the best forage as the season changes, they were able to gain a lot more weight. Even though these migrations have a lot of risk associated with them in terms of evading predators, fences, roads, and other development, it seems that that risk is well worth it in terms of finding better food and making healthier fawns. And the researchers didn't necessarily say this in this study, but a lot of evidence supports the idea that healthier, fatter fawns are also more likely to be giant bucks later in life. This study is further evidence of just how incredibly important these migrations are. By covering more ground, the population is more productive, and with increasing threats to migration corridors, if they get disrupted, you can expect to see less deer and smaller deer. In Idaho, a bill that could jeopardize public lands and wildlife is moving through the legislature. Senate Bill 1300 would make it so that the governor is the one who appoints agency director positions. Currently, the directors are chosen either by a board or a commission of individuals that represent different regions of the state. And while the governor does generally appoint those boards and commissions, it spreads out the decision-making to better reflect each region of the state. Most of the press I've been seeing in opposition to this has been highlighting the threat posed to Harriman State Park. The 11,000-acre park is located west of Yellowstone National Park, and it's famous for amazing fishing and wildlife habitat. The land was donated to the state in 1977, and according to the grandson of the original landowner, Averell Harriman, it was done so under the condition that the property would be managed by personnel chosen on basis of merit, not politics. Harriman went on to say that their family gift is currently under threat by this bill, and that the park has been enjoyed by their family and millions of visitors for years, and it needs to continue to be protected for the people of Idaho. So it's pretty interesting to see a member of the family that donated the land be so opposed to seeing the state parks director be a political appointee versus someone chosen by merit. While the state parks director is certainly of concern, so is the director of Idaho Fish and Game. Critics note that this is another move towards politicizing wildlife management rather than doing what's best for wildlife. The Idaho Wildlife Federation, Friends of Harriman State Park, and many Idaho residents have been vocal in their opposition to this bill, yet it passed out of committee and is moving forward in the Senate. So if you're a resident of Idaho and care about this, now might be a good time to get a hold of your state legislature and let them know how you feel. A new farm bill moved forward in the House Agricultural Committee, showing promise to solidify what has been one of the most impactful things for hunting access and wildlife habitat in the United States. The farm bill is a massive piece of legislation that in theory is updated every 5 years, but because it's so big and has so many parts, it's often tough to pass in whole, with the last farm bill being passed in 2018. Since 2018, many programs within the Farm Bill have been operating on extensions, but it's tough to make progress without passing it in full. While the bill has numerous things under its umbrella, we as hunters are generally interested in the parts that affect public access, wildlife, and habitat. Most of what the bill impacts occurs on private land, but with 70% of the land in the United States being private, it's critical to incentivize landowners to maintain or create wildlife habitat and to provide public access. So the parts to do with that within the Farm Bill are the Conservation Reserve Program, which pays landowners to remove farmland from production and plant quality grasses and forbs, creating wildlife habitat. It also includes a voluntary public access and habitat incentive program, which provides funding for more public access on private land, and it incentivizes landowners landowners to manage for good wildlife habitat. It includes provisions to encourage land management that connects habitat and migration corridors across the landscape. It also includes the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, which provides funds and assistance for landowners for things such as making their irrigation systems more efficient, or building wildlife-friendly fence, or changing farming practices to improve soil health and habitat. And that's just a brief overview of some of the things that impact hunters within the Farm Bill. Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership does a great job of identifying and analyzing these things, and they looked over this 800-page bill. Aaron Field with TRCP summarized the key conservation provisions of what the new version will provide. I highly recommend checking out their blog post on this if you want to wrap your head around how different programs will be impacted. Reading through the changes, most are fine. Some funding is shifted around, but largely conservation funding is staying conservation funding. And realistically, if this bill was passed as is, it would still be a win for hunters, as it solidifies a lot of funding, fills in some gaps where conservation easements were needed, and strengthens and provides some new tools for forest and watershed health. But TRCP did note some missed opportunities, such as not improving the Conservation Reserve Program, not fully funding the Voluntary Public Access and Habitat Incentive Program, and some provisions in there that could make it more difficult to do prescribed burns along with managing forest fires. There are still some sticking points within the Farm Bill, such as SNAP funding, pesticide labeling, and states' authority to regulate swine, which is outside of TRCP's scope, but it is helpful to know where these sticking points are to where things might get held up. This is a pretty big deal that this bill is moving forward, and things are undoubtedly going to change as it makes its way through, but I'm glad that TRCP has a pulse on it and is advocating for the things that we care about as hunters. A few recent articles from Henry Brannon summarize the unfortunate trend in the Pacific Northwest of losing hunting access on large tracts of land as it changes ownership. They highlighted the Elochoman Valley, where traditionally timber companies own land that was usually open to hunting and access. But since the 80s, more and more timberland has been sold to investment banks and wealthy individuals, many of which are outside the United States. More and more land within the valley continued to sell and gates were put up. Sometimes access would be opened up for a short while and then shut down. Some landowners started charging for access, and now there are numerous lock gates that block not only access to the old timberland, but also public land that is now inaccessible. Several individuals were interviewed that voiced their frustrations over this lost access, and some were pointing blame at the company American Forest Management. But when reached out for comment, the company stated that they're simply the middleman, they're doing what their clients want. It was noted that around 7% of Waukegan County is now owned by German royalty, and one of the landowners went on the record to talk about their investment. When asked about allowing access to the land, he noted that timber harvest is much more profitable than a hunting lease, so that's where his current focus lies. While access is currently shut down on the property, the landowner did say they would consider allowing access, but they asked for patience, also saying that tone is everything. If you talk nicely to someone, you usually get better results. So I guess it is possible there could be access once again, but it is far from a guarantee. Unfortunately, this serves as a cautionary tale to not take access for granted. Just because you can hunt somewhere now doesn't mean that you'll be able to forever. All right, we're going to jump over to our deeper dive where we're talking about CWD, game farms, and how some simple solutions could go a long ways in curbing the disease. Talking about chronic wasting disease this week. It's been a minute since we've talked about it, but it's still very much
in the news.
And I saw a couple things talking about this recent event in Idaho, where they ended up having to kill 82 mule deer within a high fence elk operation. Right. So there's high fence elk farms in Idaho, and these deer were able to crawl under the fence and get in there. And there's 82 of them, which is kind of crazy to me that it got to that level before anything was done about it. But Idaho Game and Fish decided that killing them was the most responsible thing to do, so that's what they did. And it kind of brings up the bigger picture of what's going on in, region-wide, multiple states have different rules as it pertains to captive facilities and chronic wasting disease, and it's kind of a mess. So we're going to talk a bit about it.
Yeah, and we're probably going to have to talk about captive cervids compared to wild cervids. Who benefits from captive cervids, and who pays for the cost of disease when it hits captive cervids? So where do you want to start, Marcus? Well, I got a map in front of me here.
I pulled up the most recent map as well, and there's a couple different sources that have kind of region-wide maps of where chronic wasting disease exists, and it's really starting to fill in more and more places. And Idaho actually doesn't have that much filled in currently, which so they're trying to. That's one of their cautionary reasons, I'm sure, for killing these deer. But
is that because they're not testing as much? Because remember when we had our first cases in Montana about 8 or 10 years ago? They're like, oh, chronic wasting disease is coming to Montana.
Mm-hmm.
They started testing along the borders of provinces and states where they have it. And then guess what? The more they tested, the more they found we had it. We've had it for a long time. So if you don't test for it, you're probably not going to have a high incidence.
Right. Yeah. It looks a lot better if you just don't, close your eyes. And honestly, I'm a little out of the loop on how much effort Idaho is putting into it. I know that they're putting some effort into it for sure. But like you said, the more you look, the more you find.
Yeah. And part of the problem is wildlife agencies. I'm not saying this is the case in Idaho, but in a lot of states and a lot of provinces, the management of this disease has been taken away from the wildlife agencies and handed over to departments of livestock.
Right, which is exactly what the case is in Idaho. So yeah.
You think that having the Department of Livestock in charge of wildlife diseases is the equivalent of having the Department of Livestock over at the Board of Education.
Right.
But anyhow.
Yeah, in fact, I kind of have like a list of most of the states that have captive facilities, and it looks like the vast majority of them are the Department of Agriculture that will oversee those operations, not the state game agencies, which is something that makes it very difficult for, the state to implement rules and regulations as it pertains to it. Like one of the easy ones would be like double fencing, right?
Yeah, to prevent contact, right? If you have two fences there's guidelines of what are best practices, build an interior fence and an exterior fence so that the wild deer can't come into contact with the deer inside.
Right.
But even though that's a best practice, there are some states that have said, well, that's going to cost extra money. We're going to waive that, or we're going to grandfather it, or whatever.
Yeah, and I believe one of the articles I read, I think it was Travis Hall and Field and Stream, that said there was something happened in 2024. It was in Idaho that eliminated the requirement for double fencing.
Right.
And so that's pretty recent, and then already there's this problem occurring.
It'd be like saying, let's get rid of seat belts. That adds to the cost of a car to put a seatbelt in there. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows this is going to lower transmission rates all the way across. But the reason I want to talk about CWD, and when you brought up this idea, is it really is that place where private property rights, which everybody appreciates private property rights. I respect them. I spent my whole life helping clients maximize their private property rights. But when does the exercise of a private property right create costs to other people? And where then does the cost end up, whether it's true write-a-check cost or the cost to other economic activities or other just social activities?
Right.
And that's what we run into with captive cervids.
Yeah, and it's obviously becoming more and more of an issue for our game populations. Like this is having a very real impact in a lot of areas. Mm-hmm. And so it's frustrating when there are groups actively lobbying against any regulations as it pertains to chronic wasting disease, and this like putting a few safe measures in place, especially when it's reasonable. I mean, I guess we can dive a little bit into just game farms in general, because some states have outlawed them to some respect, where you they're literally not allowed. I mean, Alaska, I guess, is the most hard stance on any of them. They're just, there's a few little farming things, but I think like for the most part they've banned it.
Yeah.
And
there a lot of states have taken measures one way or the other. Like in Montana, we have taken the position that there was a ballot initiative. I can't remember what year it was, like 2004 or something like that.
Right.
That we were not going to allow captive shooting facilities. So you could keep your cervids around.
Yeah,
if
and
you
I
want
think
to keep them in a pen, but you can't run it as a shooting facility.
And I believe that I don't think they're allowing new ones either, because it was
Right.
mostly stuff that was
Right, the moratorium.
grandfathered in, but
Yep.
you no longer can have the.
And that happened by
shooting
ballot
range.
initiative, because we ended up with some game farms that were not monitoring very well, and we had an outbreak of tuberculosis and CWD.
Yeah.
Well, the public said, hey, if you want to run an operation like that, you have to comply.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the legislature started trying to pull control away from our Game and Fish Agency over to the Department of Livestock, voters just said, you know what? We've had enough. We are not going to pay these costs. So it's a very difficult one. And a little background on the Montana ballot initiative. I voted against it. And people are like,
really?
What? Not because I was in favor of disease and in favor of captive cervids. I hate ballot initiatives. I always say we have a representative republic for a reason. So let's do this legislatively. And some of my friends said, Randy, that's like you're having a fatal heart attack and you tell your wife to just drive the speed limit on the way to the hospital. You're too concerned about protocol. You're going to die. The end result's not going to be good. There's times where you got to just let it go. So it's kind of funny that I voted against it, even though I did not want cervids, captive shooting facilities.
But yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that like that's how this all started, like in the U.S., or that's where they traced it back to, is research. It was a research
facility,
but
Colorado.
it's a captive deer research facility that's where it very likely started spreading throughout the United States, and so we know that this is a problem.
We know it is, and we look at our neighbors to the north, particularly Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has a lot of captive shooting facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And where does Montana have the highest incidence of CWD? On the Saskatchewan border.
Right.
And so every state's got different rules around it. There's been incentives to depopulate some of these herds. I'm trying to remember what I read where how much was paid to these land, if you want to call them, I don't know if they're landowners, they're captive cervid operators. There's government money being paid to pay for the depopulation of their diseased herds.
Gotcha.
So your taxpayer dollars are going, in some instances, to pay millions of dollars for depopulation. That's the small part of the cost of CWD. The bigger cost is monitoring, researching, trying to control it, trying to educate people about it, trying to get the cervid industry to adopt best practices.
Right.
So there's a huge cost there that's dollars, and then there's a huge cost in, let's think about season types. Right? Colorado has a very high incidence of it, and they're having to manage their season types. So they know that the highest incidence in mule deer is older age class bucks.
Right.
So they have to design a lot of their seasons to try remove the older age class bucks to lower the prevalence.
Yeah.
That's exactly what hunters want to have more age class.
It's not a popular stance, but that's kind of what the WAFWA Mule Deer Working Group is kind of recommending in these spots is to manage for lower age class deer. Yet, I mean, that's not what a lot of hunters are advocating for. People want to shoot big bucks. It's
right. So here comes this
nature.
Social and cultural cost that you really can't put a price on. Now, I know as quick as you post this, there's going to be some of the advocates for the cervid industry, the pen shooters, who are going to be posting comments. You don't know what you're talking about. This is just a money-making scheme. No, it's not. Every scientific agency in the country has identified this as a critical issue for wildlife.
Right. And that's the thing. There's a lot we don't know about chronic wasting disease, but one of the things we do know is that captive facilities can be a very big issue. Right. And so like you said, best practices, like that's the low hanging fruit. It's
Right.
like in some cases and in some states, the
Separation,
culture's
yeah.
there. It's the industry's established. You're probably you're not going to get rid of these high fence
No,
operations,
you're not.
but we can at least mitigate,
Mm-hmm.
spreading the disease around and being just a way, a vector that it, and like even if I don't know, because there are a lot of testing requirements in these facilities in most states.
Right.
But
Every mortality is supposed to be tested under a best practices situation, whether it's a hunter shot it died of natural causes, it got sick, whatever. Yeah. Best practices says you test every mortality within the facility. So there's these things that are there, and the interesting part, if you watch the debates and discussions among the cervid industry owners of these facilities, there's one group of them that wants all these protocols. They want to have the industry follow best practices. And then you got some other folks who just want to poor boy it, cut corners, push all of the costs over to the public, let the public take care of all the costs. So it's interesting to see the dynamic within that industry, where you have some who just, if this helps, we'll do it.
Right.
And then you have others who say, under no circumstance, and the others very often have the ear of a legislator.
It's a tough one. So you mentioned earlier Minnesota as an example. What are the main issues there? Because that seemed to be one of the, I don't know if it's the worst example, but
no, I would say its neighbor Wisconsin is probably the worst example. So Wisconsin has a lot of known disease within captive facilities. Some have been depopulated. Some are still currently operating as facilities. The agency has paid a mountain of money trying to figure out ways to control this. The politics of it are really ugly. There's probably, it's kind of like the disease itself. Right now, there's no known live animal test. There's no known cure for it. And in the politics of it, there's no known future that looks real positive. There's just a lot of fighting and debating, if you want to call it that, lobbying to say, well, just don't make me pay those costs.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. If you want to exercise the property right of owning a private herd of cervids, knock yourself out. I don't really care. And if someone wants to go there and shoot them, I don't really care. But whatever costs you incur and impose on our wildlife resource, and you impose on the public, you pay those costs, not the public.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. You already basically said this at the beginning too, but just because it's happening on your private ranch doesn't mean that it's not affecting things outside of your private ranch. This stuff spreads. It's not like the example of like if you pour gasoline in a stream and it's on your property, that's still going to end up downstream on someone else's property, and it's going to have an impact on them.
Yeah. And so it's complicated. It's unfortunate that a lot of people who claim to be hunting advocates want to go after scientists and researchers and disease ecologists because they're in the captive cervid industry.
Right.
And so they use their platforms, they use their voice, they use their influence to isolate and attack and just reduce the credibility of these scientists who are working on this.
Yeah.
And that's not good for the wild wildlife populations that we as hunters enjoy. We've spent so much effort to manage these, to build them up. We want to protect them, we want to enhance them, and we want them to grow. But yet there are some among our group who want to say, I'm a hunter, and that's fine. But if you're a hunter, I would hope that you would advocate for best practices when it comes to the captive cervid industry.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of things that can be done for CWD, but that's the low-hanging fruit of like, hey, let's at the very least, have some best practices like the double fencing, mandatory testing, just making sure that these it's not being spread,
Yeah.
to the wildlife. Because it's
Right.
just, in the scheme of things, like, are there costs? Yes. But in the scheme of, like, the total cost to, everyone out, not just the private landowner or the person who has that facility, but all of us
Right.
who, in part own these public resources, the deer and
Right.
elk and stuff that are going to get chronic wasting disease. It's like, you have to look at it from a bigger
Yeah.
bigger picture.
I mean, that's the business model that's as old as time itself. Privatize the revenues and externalize or push the costs to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I could make money if I could convince the government to pay all my expenses, but I got to keep all the revenue. That's a hell of a deal. And it's just one of these things that it doesn't have to be as complicated as it is, but it's as complicated as it is because there are people with motivations, financial motivations, because they are so involved. They're sponsored by the cervid industry and all the ancillary activity that goes on around that. And so they use their voice and their platforms to discredit anyone and anything in any science related to CWD. And if someone wants to put a comment down below that I don't know what I'm talking about, knock yourself out. But this isn't what I'm talking about. This is what the best scientists on the continent are saying.
Right. Well, I guess the point of this is just to provide a little bit more awareness around it, because I think so many people just brush aside CWD and it's like, oh, it's blown out of proportion. It's not an issue. And it's like, well,
It's
there's
a big issue.
Yeah, especially like if you look at Wisconsin and some of these places that have had it for a while, it's not going away and it's not going to just solve itself. So,
yeah, so my last caution to anyone who does not have it in your state, keep monitoring, keep testing.
Mm-hmm.
If your state agency, wildlife agency, still has control over the captive cervid industry, don't let your legislature give control of that to a livestock agency. Because once that happens, the whole game changes. The public's voice, the wildlife voice in the discussion is completely mitigated, and that's why they want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my word of wisdom to anyone involved.
All right. Well, thank you, Randy.
Yeah, thank you.